What would you do if, in a single moment, everything you loved was ripped away from you? Your family, your home, your dreams gone. Most people never imagine it could happen to them, but for one man, it did. This isn't just a story about loss. It's about the unimaginable strength it takes to rise when the world has already buried you. And if you watch till the end, this story will change how you see life, pain, and the human spirit forever. Have you ever had one of those days where everything feels normal until it doesn't? Where a single phone call or a knock on the door turns your entire world upside down? For Daniel Hayes, that day began like any other. He woke up in his modest apartment in Chicago, poured himself a cup of coffee, and glanced at a photo of his wife and daughter smiling back at him from the kitchen counter. It was a reminder of why he worked so hard, why he sacrificed his own dreams to provide for them. Daniel was a man who believed in stability. He worked a steady job as an insurance agent, paid his bills on time, and prided himself on being dependable. But deep down, he often wondered if life had more to offer. He'd see people chasing passions, building businesses, or traveling the world, and a small voice would whisper, "You were meant for more." Yet, like so many of us, he silenced that voice. That morning, as he grabbed his keys and stepped out into the crisp air, he had no idea his life was about to shatter. By nightfall, Daniel would lose everything he thought defined him. But in that loss, he'd uncover a strength he never knew existed. A strength that would not only change his life, but inspire countless others. And it all began with a single, unexpected phone call. What's the worst phone call you've ever received? Was it a simple piece of bad news, or something that changed everything in an instant? For Daniel, that call came just as he was finishing lunch at his desk. The office buzzed with the usual chatter, but when he saw his phone light up with an unknown number, a strange chill ran through him. "Mr. Hayes?" The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "There's been an accident." His heart stopped. The words blurred together after that. "Highway crash, critical condition, get here fast." His hands trembled as he grabbed his jacket and bolted out of the office, knocking over his coffee without noticing. The world outside suddenly felt too loud, too bright, and yet eerily silent all at once. Driving to the hospital was a blur of red lights and frantic prayers. He didn't even remember how he got there. Just the sound of his shoes squeaking on the polished floors as he ran through the ER, searching for answers. A doctor finally met him with a look that said more than words ever could. That single moment would carve a scar so deep that Daniel would never be the same man again. But this wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning of the storm that would strip him of everything he thought he needed to survive. Have you ever watched a doctor's lips move, but the words don't seem real, like your mind refuses to let them in because accepting them would break you? That's exactly how Daniel felt standing in that cold hospital hallway. "Your wife, she didn't make it," the doctor said softly, his eyes heavy with pity. The world spun. Daniel's knees buckled as if gravity itself had betrayed him. He gripped the wall, trying to breathe, trying to believe this was just a nightmare he'd wake up from. His wife, Emily, the woman he'd built his entire life around, was gone. And his little girl, Lily, was fighting for her life. Hours passed in a haze of waiting rooms, whispered prayers, and the sterile smell of antiseptic that burned his nose. He thought about all the moments he'd taken for granted, the quiet dinners, bedtime stories, the way Emily would laugh at his worst jokes. Now all of it felt like a cruel memory. Bills started piling up almost immediately. The insurance company he had worked for, the one he'd given years of his life to, offered condolences and then a severance package. Suddenly, he was jobless, buried in medical expenses, and left alone to raise a daughter who would never walk again. Daniel's apartment began to feel like a prison. Every corner reminded him of Emily. Every empty chair screamed her absence. Nights were the worst, sitting in silence, staring at the bills, wondering how he would feed his daughter, let alone pay for her care. And just when he thought things couldn't get worse, a single letter arrived in the mail that would push him closer to the edge than he'd ever been. Have you ever opened a letter that made your hands shake before you even read the words? Daniel sat at his kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills when he tore open the envelope. It was an eviction notice. He had 30 days to leave the apartment that held the last memories of Emily, the only place Lily felt safe. His chest tightened as he read it again and again, hoping he'd misunderstood. But there it was, in bold black print, 30 days. He sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. For the first time, he let himself break. He screamed into the empty apartment, a sound of pure pain and helplessness that echoed off the walls. Lily was still in the hospital, fighting to recover. And now Daniel faced the reality of homelessness. He had no job, no savings, and no family close enough to help. The friends who had once called every day slowly stopped checking in. People care at first, but when the tragedy drags on, life moves on for them, while yours stands still. Daniel started selling whatever he could: furniture, clothes, Emily's old jewelry, anything to buy more time. Each idol he sold felt like a piece of his past slipping away. Yet no matter how much he hustled, the bills kept coming. And then, as if fate wasn't done testing him, a single phone call arrived late at night that would send him spiraling even deeper.
What would you do if just when you thought life couldn't get worse, you got a call that proved you were wrong? Daniel was sitting in the dimly lit hospital waiting room, his head buried in his hands, when his phone rang. It was the police. "Mr. Hayes, we need to talk about your car," the officer said. His voice was steady, but Daniel felt his heart sink. His car, one of the last valuable things he owned, had been stolen and totaled in a hit and run. There would be no insurance payout, no replacement, nothing. Daniel hung up, his mind numb. The weight of everything was crushing him. Emily's death, Lily's injuries, the eviction notice, and now this. He walked down the hall to Lily's room, forcing himself to smile as she lay there, pale but trying to be brave for her dad. She didn't need to know how broken he was. That night, he stepped outside the hospital to get some air. The Chicago winter wind bit at his skin as he stared up at the city lights. He felt invisible, like a ghost watching the world move on without him. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if it would be easier to disappear altogether. But then he thought of Lily's tiny hand gripping his, her eyes silently begging him not to leave her too. And that thought, fragile as it was, kept him standing. What Daniel didn't know was that the darkest night of his life was about to set the stage for an unexpected turning point. Have you ever met someone by complete chance, only to realize later that they were sent to change your life? Daniel was sitting in the hospital cafeteria, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee he couldn't afford, when a stranger sat down across from him. She was an older woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She said, "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said softly. Daniel managed a tired laugh, unsure why he even responded. Maybe it was the warmth in her voice or the way she spoke, like she understood pain. Her name was Margaret, and she was there visiting her own grandson who had been battling leukemia. Over the next few days, they crossed paths often. She'd bring him coffee, share small stories, and listen without judgment as Daniel poured out his grief. One morning, Margaret handed him a small piece of paper. On it was a name and number. She said, "He helps single parents find emergency housing. Call him. Don't give up." Daniel almost didn't. He'd lost faith in people, in hope, in everything. But something in Margaret's eyes told him to try. That call would be the first step toward a path Daniel never saw coming, a path that would push him beyond survival into something far greater. But before that transformation could begin, life was about to test Daniel's strength in one more brutal way. Have you ever felt like every time you take one step forward, life shoves you 2 steps back? Just as Daniel felt a flicker of hope from Margaret's kindness, another blow crammed down. Daniel's doctors called him into a small consultation room. "We need to discuss her long-term care," one of them said gently. The words long-term care felt like a knife twisting in his chest. They explained Lily would need months, maybe years of therapy, specialized equipment, and constant medical supervision. The cost would be astronomical. Daniel sat frozen, staring at the stack of papers the doctor handed him. Numbers and medical terms blurred together as reality sunk in. He was already drowning in debt. Now the weight on his shoulders felt unbearable. That night, Daniel drove to his nearly empty apartment to pack a few essentials. Sitting in the dark, he held a photo of Emily and Lily in happier times. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "I don't know if I can do this." But even in his despair, he remembered Margaret's paper tucked in his jacket. With trembling hands, he dialed the number. A man named Robert answered, a soft-spoken volunteer who promised to meet him in the morning. Daniel didn't know it yet, but that single phone call would lead him to a place and a group of people that would completely rewrite his future. Have you ever walked into a place expecting nothing, only to feel a shift in your soul the moment you stepped inside? The next morning, Daniel met Robert outside a modest brick building tucked between two towering apartment complexes. A small sign read, "New Beginnings Community Center." Inside, the smell of fresh coffee and warm pancakes filled the air. Volunteers buzzed around, greeting families with smiles. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: safety. Robert introduced him to staff members who helped him fill out forms for temporary housing, food assistance, and therapy programs for Lily. It wasn't much, but it was more than Daniel ever expected. They gave him keys to a tiny apartment attached to the center. The room was small, barely big enough for 2 beds, but it was clean, warm, and safe. That night, Lily slept peacefully for the first time since the accident, clutching a teddy bear one of the volunteers had given her. Daniel sat by her bed, tears in his eyes, whispering, "We're going to be okay." But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end of their struggles. Safety was just step one. There were still bills, therapy, and a future to rebuild. Yet, in that quiet moment, Daniel felt something powerful stirring, a spark of determination. Little did he know, this small community center would introduce him to a person who would not only change his life, but challenge him to become more than he ever thought he could be. Have you ever met someone who sees strength in you when all you see is failure? A week after moving into the community center's apartment, Daniel was sitting in the small cafeteria, sipping on his usual black coffee, when a man with broad shoulders and a confident smile approached him. He said, "You're Daniel, right?" "I'm Marcus," the man said, extending his hand. Marcus was a former Marine turned volunteer mentor at the center. His energy was calm but commanding, the kind that made people stop and listen. They began talking, and Daniel reluctantly opened up about losing Emily, about Lily's condition, and how life had crushed him to the point where he'd stopped believing in himself. Marcus listened quietly, then leaned forward and said something Daniel would never forget. "You're still here. That means you haven't lost. Not yet." That simple statement sparked something in Daniel. Marcus invited him to join a small men's support group at the center, a circle of people who had faced homelessness, addiction, grief, and still found a way to rise. Daniel was hesitant at first. Sharing his pain with strangers felt impossible, but Marcus had a way of making him believe it was worth trying. That night, Daniel sat among a group of men who carried their own scars. As he listened to their stories of resilience, he felt a strange mix of emotions: sadness, hope, and a quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, he could fight his way back too. But Daniel didn't know that Marcus was about to challenge him in a way that would change everything.
What if the person you least expected became the one who pushed you to rise again? Marcus wasn't just a mentor, he was a force of nature. After their first meeting, he started showing up at Daniel's door every morning at 6 a.m. sharp. "Get dressed," Marcus would say with a grin. "We're going for a run." At first, Daniel hated it. He was exhausted, depressed, and the last thing he wanted was to jog through freezing Chicago streets. But Marcus wouldn't take no for an answer. "Your body moves, your mind heals," he'd say, his tone firm but encouraging. Those early mornings became a ritual. Slowly, Daniel started to feel stronger, not just physically, but mentally. Marcus introduced him to basic meditation and journaling, teaching him how to face his emotions instead of running from them. For the first time since the accident, Daniel felt a sliver of control returning to his life. The support group meetings became his lifeline. He started opening up, sharing his grief, and listening to others who had been through unimaginable pain. In their stories, he found pieces of himself, proof that healing was possible. But Marcus wasn't done. One day after their run, he looked Daniel in the eye and said, "You've survived hell, brother. Now it's time to build something from the ashes." Daniel didn't know exactly what Marcus meant, but he could feel it. A storm of change was brewing. And this time, it wasn't a storm to destroy him, it was one that would force him to rise. What if the very thing meant to break you became the reason you discovered your purpose? One evening after group therapy, Daniel found himself staying behind to help clean up the center's dining hall. As he stacked chairs and wiped tables, he overheard a young man telling Marcus that he wanted to get a job but didn't know how to start. Something stirred in Daniel. Before losing everything, he had spent years working in insurance and finance. He knew how to write resumes, prep for interviews, and manage money. That night, Daniel offered to help the young man polish his resume. It was a small act, but for the first time in months, Daniel felt useful again. Word spread quickly. Within weeks, Daniel was helping more residents, single parents, veterans, people fresh out of prison, create job applications and plan their next steps. It wasn't much, but it gave him purpose. Marcus noticed and pulled him aside. "This is it, man. This is what rebuilding looks like. You're turning your pain into someone else's hope." Daniel hadn't realized it yet, but he was slowly becoming a pillar of strength for others, even as he was still healing himself. The more he helped, the stronger he felt. Lily was thriving too, her therapy sessions bringing back her smile, her laughter echoing through their tiny apartment. But just when Daniel thought life was finally settling, a new challenge appeared, one that would test his courage and commitment more than anything else before. What if the biggest challenge of your life disguised itself as an opportunity? Months had passed since Daniel first stepped foot in the community center. He had grown stronger, steadier, and more hopeful. But one day Marcus walked into the cafeteria with a flyer in hand. He said, "You should see this," sliding it across the table. It was a leadership training program, a 6-month course designed to help people rebuild careers and start nonprofits. Daniel stared at it, shaking his head. "I can't do this. I'm barely keeping it together," he muttered. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes sharp but kind. "You can and you will, because you're not just surviving anymore, you're leading, whether you see it or not. These people look up to you." The thought terrified him. Daniel had been hiding behind his pain for so long that stepping into a position of leadership felt impossible. But Marcus wasn't letting him back down. "Apply," he said. "What's the worst that happens? They say no? You've heard worse." That night, Daniel sat in their small apartment while Lily colored at the table. He stared at the application, hands trembling. Emily's photo rested beside him, her smile frozen in time. "What would you tell me to do?" he whispered. Deep down, he already knew the answer. With a deep breath, Daniel filled out the application and hit submit. He didn't know it yet, but this single act of courage would mark the beginning of a transformation that would ripple far beyond his own life. What if the moment you've been waiting for finally arrives, but it terrifies you more than anything else? A few weeks after submitting his application, Daniel received an email. "Congratulations, you've been accepted." His heart pounded as he read the words over and over. He was in. The first day of the leadership program was overwhelming. Daniel walked into a sleek downtown building filled with confident, well-dressed people who looked nothing like him. He felt out of place in his thrift store suit, carrying years of pain in his eyes. But when it was his turn to introduce himself, something shifted. He told his story, not with shame, but with honesty. And instead of judgment, he saw respect in their faces. The next 6 months were grueling. Daniel balanced Lily's therapy sessions, part-time jobs, and classes that pushed him far beyond his comfort zone. He learned about business, fundraising, public speaking, and how to turn an idea into a movement. Every night he'd come home exhausted, but Lily would greet him with a smile and say, "I'm proud of you, Daddy." Those words became his fuel. Slowly, Daniel's vision became clear. He wanted to create a foundation to help families like his, families blindsided by tragedy, left with nothing but fear and bills. The boy who once sat in a dark apartment wondering if life was worth living was now standing taller, his pain transforming into purpose. But his journey wasn't over yet. A single phone call was about to catapult him into a moment that would define everything he'd been working towards. What if one phone call held the power to prove that every tear, every sleepless night, every painful step was worth it? Daniel was reviewing notes for his final presentation when his phone buzzed. It was an unfamiliar number, but something in his gut told him to answer. "Mr. Hayes, we've reviewed your proposal. We'd like to fund your foundation, fully." For a moment, Daniel couldn't breathe. He blinked back tears as the words sank in. Fully funded. The organization he'd built from the ashes of his own tragedy was going to become real. This wasn't just a win for him, it was hope for families like his, a lifeline for those standing where he once stood, alone, afraid, and broken. When he hung up, Lily was in her wheelchair, coloring at the kitchen table.
Daniel knelt beside her, tears streaming down his face, as he whispered, "We did it, baby. Mommy would be so proud." Months later, Daniel stood on a stage in front of hundreds of donors and families telling his story. His voice was steady, his heart strong. He wasn't the man crushed by tragedy anymore. He was proof that pain could become purpose, that loss could birth something powerful. And as the audience rose to their feet in applause, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Sometimes life has to break you so you can rise, stronger than you ever imagined. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect. How would you turn pain into purpose? Daniel's journey reminds us that sometimes life's greatest tragedies can become the spark for something extraordinary. Thank you for watching. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs hope today. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories that remind us all of the strength we carry within. Because sometimes the most broken hearts hold the brightest light.